Hello everyone and welcome to episode 11 of the Pollination Podcast. Today we're going to be comparing raising queens in mini mating nukes versus 5-frame mating nukes. So my main focus for the business this year has been to start up a queen breeding program. We started one last year, but we're just kind of getting the basics down. And now this year I've been investing most of my time, and we've invested quite a bit of finances into growing the program. One of the main challenges we've been facing is how to produce a large quantity of mated queens to supply customers. A lot of the large commercial queen breeding operations are focusing on quantity as opposed to quality, and that's not something I want to do. At the same time, I want to produce enough quantity to be able to provide not just for the smaller hobby beekeeper, but for some of these larger commercial operations. Just because, honestly, they're going to be more profitable in selling queens to those guys. It's a lot easier to sell a large surplus of queens to someone than selling 100 queens to 100 different people. So one type of mating nuke that these large commercial operations are using are these mini mating nukes. There's many different styles, there's different sizes, there's double mating nukes. We have tried what's called a mini styrofoam nuke. Two types we're trying out are a 3-frame and a 4-frame, and they both have some pros and cons there. And we've only recently really gotten into raising them. We've got about 100 established at the moment. I just ordered another 100, so hopefully we can have about 200 rolling. Up until this year, we've mostly been raising mated queens in 5-frame nukes. Just because we produce a lot of nukes for sale, that's how we make a lot of our splits, and they make actually really great queens. But the problem we were having is it's an enormous investment in both bees and finances to create these 5-frame nukes, and to just sell a $25 queen out of them is not very profitable. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in the process of a queen hatching from a queen cell and then mating and then being good enough quality to sell. So we're finding that we're losing a large percentage of these nukes on a monthly basis. It became really troublesome. It became very, very expensive, honestly, to keep losing these nukes and constantly having to rebuild them and just selling these queens that are not super profitable in small quantities. You definitely have to move large quantities of queens to make it profitable. It's the same thing with queen cells. Not very profitable to raise them, to sell a few cells here and there. You need to sell several hundred. I need a commercial guy to come up here and buy 500 cells, and then it's worth more of the effort. Of course, you get the benefit of having queen cells or mated queens in your own operation, and that's pretty hard to quantify as far as economics go. Obviously, I know the price it would cost to purchase a cell or purchase a queen, but there's an enormous value in me having queen cells that are always in an incubator, that I have mating nukes that I know already have mated queens that have been checked, and all I have to do go down there and just to grab them and cage them, and I can take them out to a bee yard and fix, any dead outs that I have, or replace a failing queen, or I can just make more splits if I have, a hive that's just too big and might swarm. That's hard to quantify that money, and I think right there, that's where the true value is having, essentially for us, an almost infinite supply of queen cells and mated queens on hand. There's a lot of value. So now we're trying to figure out, okay, how can we increase the quantity of our mated queens without dropping the quality too much? Because in the queen breeding world, probably more so than in any other type of aspect of beekeeping, in my opinion, reputation is everything. Everybody's honey is going to be pretty similar. If you have beehives across the road from me, our honey's going to look the same, taste the same. If we both send an 8-frame hive to California to pollinate the almond orchards, my bees are going to pollinate the same as your bees. If I sell you a 5-frame nuke with 3 brood and 2 honey, and you sell someone that same nuke, they're going to be about the same. What really separates you as a beekeeper, it's really, really a unique identifier, is your quality of your queens and the breed of your queens. So that's really important. And if you develop a bad reputation, especially early on, it's really hard to shake it. Because I've heard of some companies around here that have sold bad queens. It sticks. I mean, I've heard some people mention the same names of certain breeders for years and years. And I've tried some of their queens, and they weren't that bad, but that bad reputation definitely precedes them, and I don't want to put myself in that position. So I do want to focus on quality, but I still have to produce enough quantity to make it financially viable to invest so much time and energy into queen breeding, because queen breeding is a full-time job in and of itself. You can forget about honey or nukes or anything else. Queens take all of your time. So for the first part of this episode, I'm just going to briefly go over the pros and cons that I've experienced with running the mini styrofoam nukes as compared to the 5-frame nukes. In the second half of the episode, I'll go into a little more details about examining a queen and determining if she's good based off her laying pattern. I want to do a whole episode about that, but I'm just going to briefly touch on it because that's really the keystone of this whole argument, is whether you have enough room to identify whether a queen is good based off the amount of room she has to lay eggs in. And just to be clear, there is no right answer for this one way or another. You have to identify what's best for you as a beekeeper and your operation. Remember, I'm coming at this from a commercial perspective, that I want to produce a large quantity of queens and sell them quickly. If you're just raising a few extra queens for a couple of hives you have in your backyard, you will probably do a very different system than what I'm talking about. So some of the pros of the mini styrofoam mating nukes are the low initial investment in equipment cost. We're currently buying ours on Temu, and I'm getting the 3-frame minis for about $8 a piece, and I'm getting the 4-frame minis for I think less than $15 a piece. So it's pretty cheap. When you buy the hives, they have everything that you need. All you probably need to do is put a coat of paint on them, and that's about it. They're ready to go. When it comes to populating the minis, there's also a super low investment when it comes to bee populations. I found that stocking the 3-frame minis only takes about 1 cup of nurse bees, and stocking the 4-frame minis, I've been more successful with using 2 cups of nurse bees. Other than that, all you need is a small amount of syrup. It's probably about a pint of syrup, give or take, and a ripe queen cell, and they're ready to go. I see some guys that are using them are gluing in wax foundation to get the bees started, or they're cutting out old pieces of the plastic foundation and gluing them in. I haven't been doing that at all. I've just been dropping these empty frames in there and letting the bees draw them out. They do draw them a little crooked sometimes, but I've also found they draw them crooked with the plastic foundation and with the wax starter strips. And it's just way faster to just throw some bees in them, some syrup and a cell, put them out. And if the frames are bad, cut it out and let them try it again. I would say these mini nukes probably have the highest profit margin of any other type of mating nuke. Just like I was explaining earlier, the equipment cost, there's really nothing to build. The syrup, a little bit of bees, and a queen cell. And then, if all goes well, in my opinion, 21 days later, after that cell hatches, you've got a queen that's ready to sell. You sell that queen for $25. You've probably paid for the cost of the first nuke. And after that, you're just going to be turning a profit. One of the main benefits I've found to the minis as compared to the 5-frame nukes is it is way faster to find and cage the queens. Obviously, there's only a cup or two of bees you have to sort through versus however many are in a 5-frame nuke, probably thousands. I found that I can find and cage queens with the minis at least twice as fast as the 5-frame nukes. I know with 5-frame nukes, I can cage about 50 queens a day, assuming I'm rebuilding hives and equalizing and doing everything. And the most I've ever done caging queens with a 5-frame nuke is 100 in a day. I can blow through 100 minis in less than a day, and that's also with fixing them, rebuilding them. Once they've got established, now getting them established, I'll talk about in a minute, that's where a lot of the work comes from. So all that sounds wonderful, right? And you go, wow, well, this is the way to raise queens. That sounds great. I just drop this little styrofoam box in there, throw some bees and syrup and a cell, and boom, just start making money. That's what I thought too at first. And if you watch some of the YouTube videos, I like to watch that California beekeeper guy. And there's a really good video, I think, from a university in Ontario that does really good with the minis. And they made it look so easy. And I thought, wow, this is the way to go. I found out really quick that they're actually a real pain in the butt to get established. You can drop a lot of bees in them and they will happily abscond within 24 hours, if not right then and there. There's a lot of tricks to trying to get them established. A lot of people online recommend sealing the bees with a cell that's going to hatch. So you'll have a virgin queen running around while the hive is sealed in like a cold, dark room for 1 to 3 days, somewhere around that time period. And then you set them out in the field and then you open them in the evening so they have time to come out slowly. We tried that. I tried 1 day, 2 day, 3 day. I tried cells. I tried putting freshly hatched virgins in there. I tried adding mated queens directly in there. There seemed to be no rhyme or reason on how these things would want to stay in that particular hive or not. In fact, if I had too many hives close together, they always tended to abandon, like 8 of them would just abandon their hives to just group into one. So you'd have one that was super big and was definitely going to swarm or abscond as soon as it could. All the others would be drained of the resources. It was very frustrating. I messed around with these things for like months at the beginning of this year, and I had so many problems. I spent so much time focusing on these that I fell behind in all my other bee work, but I was just obsessed with making them work. I knew they could. I know a lot of operations use them. I just kind of had to find the key. And what worked for me was I finally bought some temp queen. That's the artificial queen pheromone. They're in these little plastic strips. What I found worked best for me is I would cut them up in quarters, and then they came with these little zip ties, and I would zip tie just a quarter of a strip to the top of a frame. I tried using a whole strip, a half strip, a third of a strip, and a quarter of a strip. I didn't see any difference as far as it causing the bees to stay in the hive or not. They're supposed to be good for 3 weeks when they're out in the field, so you have a lot of time once you put them on there to get bees in there and to refill them and try again. They were a little pricey, but when you cut them in quarters, they're not quite so pricey. And in my opinion, it's absolutely worth at least the very first round when you don't have comb, you don't have brood, and they're just fresh out of the factory. They don't even smell like bees. Save yourself the headache and just buy some queen pheromone and cut it up. As soon as I started doing that, I was getting at least a 50% take. And when I say take, I just mean the bees weren't running out of there after a few days. They started drawing the frames, started making honey, pollen, and the population was good enough that I could put a cell in there. First round of queens would hatch. Up until I used the queen pheromone, I was constantly dumping bees in them. Almost every day I'd go out to a bee yard, I'd shake some bees in this homemade shaker box that I had built. I would drop them in there, and within 1 to 3 days, they were gone. Or they would just congregate in one particular box. It was a nightmare. Once you get them established though, and you have bees that stay and they draw their frames, they're really just a normal beehive at that point. They're very small, so you have to really keep close tabs on them. And this is where a lot of people don't like them, because they're so small. They get filled up with bees really quickly, and they don't necessarily swarm, although I have seen a few swarm. What they do is abscond, and absconsion means all the bees, the queen, everything just leaves. They don't leave a virgin queen behind. They don't leave some nurse bees sitting on the brood. They just leave it, and you lose the whole hive. And that happens pretty quickly. When I first built the 100 nukes, I was on a 1-week cycle, so I was running through all 100 once a week every week. So that was taking about 1 day a week just doing that. That was a little too much of my schedule it was eating up, so I've recently gone to going through them every 2 weeks, and that seems fine. I'm able to save them if they get weak. I'm able to give them more food. It works pretty well. I haven't had any big issues with swarming or absconsion. I would like to maybe try going on a 3-week cycle, but I'm afraid that might be a little bit too long. When I go through them, if I think there are some that are a little bit weak, I'll go to a bee yard that I have about a mile down the road, and I have this shaker box that I made that I was talking about earlier. It's just 2 empty deep boxes with some steel plates to bind them together, and I use some 1/8" hardware cloth as a lid and on a bottom, and I also have it running around the inside of the boxes, so there's a ventilation in the middle between the 2 boxes and on the top and the bottom, and I screwed in some handles for easier carrying. I keep the top lid kind of stuck down with some magnets. I know there's some really nice shaker boxes that the guys who make packaged bees use, but this was just kind of a homemade rig up thing, but it's been working fine. And I just shake a bunch of nurse bees in there from another bee yard. I have a spray bottle with some water that I miss so they don't get too hot. And then I just bring that back to the minis. And I used to open every mini, take a frame out, and I would take about 1 cup of nurse bees. I just have a little scoop, and I would dump them directly into the mini nuke. I would put the frame back, put the lid back on. Of course, they're running everywhere, so you're smashing some. And it took forever, and I got tired of bending over 100 times just to put more bees in. So the other day I found a system that works a lot better. Is I take my shaker box and I put it in my wheelbarrow, and I have my minis running in a long line along my tree line, and I just push the wheelbarrow down the line, and I open the little lid to the shaker box. I miss the bees so they don't come out, and when I come to a mini that is low populated, I just take a scoop, and all the minis are sitting directly on the ground, and I just dump a cup of nurse bees directly in the front of the mini. I don't open it or anything, and they'll crawl in there because, they'll smell the queen pheromone or the other bees, and that's worked really well, and it's like cut down the amount of time it takes to add bees to those minis by a huge margin. Now, you don't want to just go randomly dumping bees. You want to know. So when I do my 2-week cycle of going through them, the way I've been marking them is I just use colored thumbtacks. If there's a virgin or a mated queen in one of them, I give it like a green thumbtack. That way I know, hey, I don't need to add a queen cell to this one, or if a customer wants a queen, I can come over to that one and check it. And if it needs populating, I'll put a red thumbtack in it. And that's really just the 2 colors. It's that easy. I'll go, okay, these have queens or potential queens. These need more bees, got a red tack. So I just take my little wheelbarrow, dump some bees in the front, and just keep rolling. And it's pretty fast. Some other issues they do have, and I found this out very recently, is that raccoons love them. I have some that are back in the woods in an area I don't go very much. And every couple of nights I was having 1 or 2 getting knocked over, and I thought it was a wind blowing them over. The syrup would be gone. Sometimes the brood would look like eaten. So I kind of figured eventually, I was like, oh, maybe it's an animal. So I set up some live traps, and yeah, sure enough, I caught a raccoon. Unfortunately, he definitely chewed through some of the mini styrofoam nukes. Obviously, they're just styrofoam, so they're not going to hold up to an animal gnawing on them. So we lost a couple of them, but we relocated the raccoon. So it hasn't been a problem since, but that seems to be an issue. And the other problem we have is if there's a lot of bad storms coming, they're definitely easily blown over. And when you're running 100 of them, I don't want to put bricks on them. I don't want to strap them to a cinder block. I don't want to put sticks on them. It's just way too much extra work. And my hope is that we can run several hundred of these in the future. My goal is 500 of these if I can handle that much. And so we just kind of have to take the occasional one that gets blown over, tipped over, or a raccoon gets it. I'm just going to kind of call that the cost of doing business, just because it just saves so much time when you want to go into them and work them. I've also noticed recently that the minis seem to have trouble keeping queen cells at the correct temperature. When we put queen cells in our 5-frame nukes, I see maybe a 1% loss on them, and I mean, they just don't hatch. You see the dead queen in there, she didn't open up for whatever reason. I see that way more often in the minis, and I've noticed it happens a lot if I put the cell in when it's really far from the hatch out date. Like if the cell's capped and it's got a week to hatching, I put them in the minis, there's a pretty good chance, it seems like 9 times out of 10, that cell will never hatch, the queen will be dead in the cell. Even if it's got a good population, if I have some in the shade, if I have some in direct sun, it doesn't seem to really matter. The bees just seem to have a really hard time regulating the internal temperature of that hive. So generally what I've started doing now with queen cells is ideally I put them in the day they're going to hatch or the day before they're going to hatch, because they're pretty tough at that point, and they can withstand temperature difference a little bit better. Or I've also been trying freshly hatched virgins. I haven't had a lot of practice with them, so I can't really recommend it, but you always have some that'll hatch out in the incubator a little bit early. I've been trying to hatch some in a queen bank, but I haven't had a lot of success with that yet. The best success I had with using the virgins is when I took my cell cup and I put it in a hair roller cage in the incubator, and I let her hatch out, and then I can just take that hair roller cage and just put it usually right in the mouth of the mini, and she'll crawl right on in there. I haven't seen any problems with the virgins mating as compared to having a queen cell that hatches directly into the hive. But I've always put virgins in that are less than 24 hours old. Because the minis have such a hard time regulating their temperature, I don't know from personal experience, but I've talked to some other people who use them, that they're really hard to get through the summer if you're in a hot climate like we are here in Florida, or they have a hard time as well if you're in a colder climate somewhere, if you have a really harsh winter. I see some people said that they can. I was talking to a guy in California the other day, and he said he runs them all the way up through September and October, which is about how long I can usually mate queens here successfully. So we're going to try to run them that long, but I have no idea if it's really possible. The minis also are very specific pieces of equipment. You can't use them for anything but mating queens, and that's kind of a downside. They're not very versatile. I would say if you're starting out queen rearing, that's probably not something you want to start with, because if you end up not liking them, you're stuck with them and you can never do anything else with them. I will say that's a big perk of the 5-frame nukes, is that you can do so many things with them. If I find out later this year that I don't want 200 minis, I'm just stuck with them, and they're just going to sit in my barn. There's nothing I can do. So hopefully we can get them to work pretty well, but just remember that they are only used to mate queens, and that's it. In the final negative I have about the minis, and if you ask another beekeeper, this is probably going to be their biggest criticism, and it's a fair criticism of the minis, is because they're so small and because the frames are so small, it becomes really difficult to judge the queen's laying pattern. So you may not know if she's a very high quality queen because most of the time they're just plugged out with honey and pollen, and she has such a tiny little spot to lay any eggs that it's pretty hard to tell. And it's also hard to wait 21 days after the cell hatches so you can see capped worker brood. I know some of the big commercial guys that use the minis are pulling the queens about every 14 days when they see eggs. That's not something I do here. I'm going to wait until I have capped worker brood at day 21. And this first cycle that I just pulled from, I was able to do that. I'm curious to see if I can continue pulling them every 21 days because now they'll have some brood, so the population is increasing. So we'll have to find that out. Okay, so that's the minis. Now I'm going to talk about the 5-frame nukes. I love the 5-frame nukes. Not necessarily always for raising queens, and I'll explain that in a second, but just as a general core part of your apiary, they're the way to go. They're really low maintenance. They can hold up pretty well when a dearth hits. They can hold up if you get behind in your beekeeping duties or life gets in the way. They're pretty easy to save if they start going downhill, in my opinion. They have a pretty low failure and absconsion rate from what I've seen. They're obviously a lot heavier than the minis, so if you have a bad storm, we have a lot of hurricanes here, they hold up pretty well. Wild animals have never bothered my plastic 5-frame nukes, not once. I do have the lids blowing open occasionally when a bad storm hits, but I recently bought a new design of the nukes that has a self-locking lid, and they've been holding up to the storms really well. As I said earlier, they're really great at incubating queen cells. There's a lot of times I'm just so busy that I'll put a queen cell in as soon as it's capped and when it's a week from hatching. And we see maybe a 1% loss on the cells. So 1% of the cells just don't hatch. I've overwintered those nukes for years. A lot of beekeepers will overwinter them and just sell them at the start of spring really early as overwintered nukes, so you can kind of get ahead of the market. The market tends to get flooded around April and May because everyone's selling nukes. So unlike the minis, the 5-frame nukes are highly versatile. You can mate queens in them. You can sell the nuke. They're a great way to make splits to increase your colony numbers. They're really easy to move. Because the 5-frame nukes frames are so large, it's really easy to judge a queen based off her laying pattern. You can get a really good idea of how well that queen's going to lay for you or your customer. You can usually have several cycles of brood in a nuke before you want to sell the queen. And like I said in my last episode, there's a lot of research that suggests that the longer a queen can lay in the hive that she was born into, she's going to be a superior queen by pretty much every metric. Some of the negative sides of the 5-frame nuke, and this is just strictly compared to the minis, is that they cost more, right? The box is larger. I typically pay $10 to $15 for a box, and I'm buying them in quantities. We'll buy a pallet of 500 at a time or something like that. If you're buying them by the individual box, then you're going to pay more. Plus, you're going to have around $25 or so in frame and foundation costs. So you're looking at like $35 to $40 in total equipment cost compared to a mini that's maybe $8 to $15 to start. So it's going to take you at least a couple queens to pay back the cost of the equipment. The investment from the honeybees is also much, much higher. Whereas the minis, you can add 1 to 2 cups of nurse bees. 5-frame nuke, in my opinion, this is just the way I like to build them. I like to build them with 3 frames of brood and 2 frames of honey. So that's a pretty huge investment to take from a parent colony to create this 5-frame nuke. And because the frames are so much larger and you have way more bees in a 5-frame nuke than you do in a mini, you're going to spend a lot longer looking for that queen. And if you have to cage 100 queens or several hundred queens, it gets pretty tedious pretty fast. So from an economic comparison of the minis to a 5-frame nuke, I just kind of want to give this example because this is what we've been saying. When that mini fails, okay, you lose a cup or 2 of bees and some syrup and a cell. If you're already running a large-scale commercial apiary, that's really nothing. The worst part is the cost and time because they just fail and abscond so much and you're constantly trying to rebuild them, at least that first time. Once they stick, then it's not so bad. When you're running 5-frame nukes to make queens and they fail, that's a pretty huge financial loss, especially if you're running hundreds of these. So for example, we're seeing about an 80% mating success on our queen cells right now, which means we're losing 20% of the nukes every round. And I'm going to call a round every month. We're really checking every 21 days, but we'll say a month just to make it easier. If you're running 5-frame nukes, you got to think you're losing a $150 nuke that you could have potentially sold, or you could have potentially made honey on, or you could have potentially sent to pollination. If, for example, you're doing like us and you're running 500 nukes, and you're suffering a 20% loss every month on those nukes due to failed queens, that's 100 nukes per month that you're losing. That's a $15,000 loss per month in nukes. And even if you sell the remaining 400 queens, and assuming that they're all good quality and you can find someone to buy them, at $25 each, that's only $10,000 in queen revenue. So you're looking at a $5,000 loss per month in this example. This is what we're dealing with in our operation at the moment. It's been really frustrating to see that because I want to do queens so bad. But when I look at it on paper, it doesn't really look good financially because I could definitely put those nukes somewhere else. Now, of course, every time we run through these 5-frame nukes or the minis every 21 days, we're rebuilding them. I'm not losing 100 nukes per month. There's no way I would let that happen. That would be a terrible business decision, and I would be a terrible beekeeper to do that. As we come across a hive that failed or becomes a drone layer or whatever, we do our best to fix it if we can. If we don't, we just merge 2 hives together and resplit them again in the next 21-day cycle. So we're maintaining that core group of 500 mating nukes, but of course it's just a lot of work to constantly have to rebuild them. I will say I've had about the same success as far as finding resources to rebuild the failed hives compared to the minis and the 5-frames. So if I run through 100 minis, and 20 of them are dead, there's still 80 minis to pull frames or bees or whatever from to rebuild the ones that failed. Same thing with the 5-frame nukes. I would say that's pretty easy both ways, but it does get really frustrating suffering a 20% loss. And I know that loss is going to increase as we get more and more closer to summer and the dearth hits. So I just want to talk a little bit on judging a queen based off her brood pattern. I think this needs to be a whole episode because I found a really great research paper that goes in depth on this, and I don't want to make this episode any longer than it already is. I think I'm already over half an hour, but I do want to briefly talk about what I've been seeing in my own experience. In my experience, queens that begin to lay around 14 days old are generally mated. But without capped worker brood at 21 days old, you are taking a risk that the queen is unmated. And culling queens based off a poor brood pattern, which typically you're looking for that shotgun brood pattern, is pretty rare. I see it often in older queens that are beginning to fail, but on a newly mated queen that's in her first month of life, the odds of me finding one that has had a bad pattern, and I've already raised a few thousand queens this year, I think I've culled out 2 or 3 or 4 queens based off a poor laying pattern. And I remember at least 2 of the queens had a physical deformity. They were both missing a leg, so they were kind of limping, and that threw them off. The other 2 had a decent pattern. They just had some drone brood mixed in a little bit with the worker brood. So that, to me, is a pretty low percentage. I'm not a master queen breeder. I'm not even close to it. But the more that I raise queens, the more I'm coming to the conclusion that the odds of culling a queen out based off a poor laying pattern within her first month is pretty negligible. It makes me think that selecting a queen based off laying pattern is actually not quite that important. Not in the early stages of her life. I was just kind of coming to this conclusion on my own, but when I was doing research for this episode, I found a research paper from the Department of Entomology of the University of Minnesota and of North Carolina. I want to do an entire episode on that paper because I think the information there is really good and there's a lot to it. But I do want to quote part of the paper because I think it's really applicable to selecting queens based off laying pattern. And that is probably the biggest criticism of the minis. I know some people won't buy queens that are raised in minis because they feel that you can't determine her laying pattern very well. And this paper pretty much directly contradicts that criticism, and it kind of goes along with my own experience that I've had so far. So the quote of the paper is, "Failure of the queen is often identified as a leading cause of honeybee colony mortality. However, the factors that can contribute to queen failure are poorly defined and often misunderstood. We studied one specific sign attributed to queen failure, poor brood pattern. In 2016 and 2017, we identified pairs of colonies with good and poor brood patterns in commercial beekeeping operations and used standard metrics to assess queen and colony health. We found no queen quality measures reliably associated with poor brood colonies. In the second year, we exchanged queens between colony pairs. A queen from a poor brood colony was introduced into a good brood colony and vice versa. We observed that brood patterns of queens originally from poor brood colonies significantly improved after placement into a good brood colony after 21 days, suggesting factors other than the queen contributed to brood pattern. Our study challenges the notion that brood pattern alone is sufficient to judge queen quality. Our results emphasize the challenges in determining the root source of problems related to the queen when assessing honeybee colony health." And the last thing I just want to briefly mention is the economics of queen breeding in the minis versus the 5-frame nukes. At the end of the day, I'm a commercial operation. I do have to be profitable. I only have so much time and energy in the day, and I have to direct that time and energy into a revenue stream that I hope that I enjoy, but also that is productive and profitable. I also hope it can benefit the beekeeping community around me. I've personally come to the conclusion that mini mating nukes are absolutely necessary for providing low-priced and readily available mated queens to the public. The downside of the 5-framers is that they cost so much to produce, both in the equipment cost and the investment in the bees themselves, that they're not really financially viable without either reducing the quantity of queens that I'm able to produce or raising the price of the queens that I'm producing, neither of which I want to do. So that's my take on raising queens in mini mating nukes versus 5-frame mating nukes. Thank you so much for listening. I'll catch you next time. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Pollination Podcast. I'm Matthew Walker from Walk in the Woods Apiary. We hope we have answered a few of your beekeeping and pollinator questions. Please share your questions and comments to our Facebook page at the Pollination Podcast.